I was standing on my front porch at 11:46 at night, wearing an old t-shirt, still holding the book I'd been reading, when I heard a rustling sound from the boxwood hedge that separated my yard from the one next door. What I saw stopped me. A woman with blonde hair and a cream-colored dress was halfway over the hedge, one bare foot already down in my grass, the other leg caught on a branch. She had a wooden, high-heeled sandal in her right hand, dangling, and she was staring straight at me with a look of pure panic. Neither of us moved. Then she said the first thing that came out of her, voice rough, a little slurred. I thought this was my house. I didn't say anything. This was obviously not her house. I was standing right there in it. 3 seconds of silence, just crickets, and the porch light throwing its yellow glow across her face. Then she said something else, quieter, almost like it slipped out before she could stop it. I didn't know where else to go. That sentence wasn't about the wrong house. I understood that much even standing there in my doorway at nearly midnight. But I didn't understand what it was actually about. Not that night. I'm telling you this from 14 months later. Dana is sitting in my kitchen right now. That same cream sandal is sitting on the shelf in my hallway, where it's been for a long time. And the question that started everything is still the one worth asking. My name is Ryan Callum. I'm 31 years old, and these days I work as a house painter and odd jobs contractor here in Columbus, Ohio. It's not what I trained for. It's not what I expected to be doing at this point in my life. But it's honest work, and most days that's enough. Before this, I was a commercial architect at a firm called Meridian and Park. I spent 6 years there, moved up from junior drafter to project lead. Then, one February afternoon, 12 of us in my department got called into a conference room and told the company was outsourcing the entire commercial design division. No warning, no performance issue, just a decision made somewhere above us that made our jobs disappear on a spreadsheet. I didn't make a scene. I didn't threaten a lawsuit or send an angry email to anyone above my old boss. I packed my drafting tablet into a box, cleared out my desk, and drove home in the middle of the afternoon on a workday, which felt strange in a way I still can't fully describe. 3 months after that, I signed a lease on a small house in Clintonville, 2 bedrooms, a modest yard, a low boxwood hedge running along the left side that separated my place from the house next door. I picked up painting jobs through word of mouth, then odd repairs, then more painting. Nobody asks a painter to justify his 5-year plan. You show up, you do the work, you get paid, you go home and read. That was the life I built for myself after my marriage ended. 4 years, no kids, no long court battle, just 2 people who had stopped being able to talk to each other honestly and eventually admitted it. No dog waiting at the door. No plant that needed watering every single day or it would die and make me feel like I'd failed at something else. Empty, but not painful. That distinction mattered more to me than I could have explained to anyone at the time. I met Dana about 2 weeks after she moved into the house next door. I was out back painting my deck railing when I heard something crash on the other side of the hedge. I looked up and saw her wrestling with a cardboard box that was clearly too heavy for one person, arms shaking, trying to angle it through her back door. I didn't say anything right away. I watched for maybe 30 seconds, the way you do when you're not sure if someone actually wants help or is just proving something to themselves. Then, she stumbled, the box tipped, and I heard something break inside it. I walked over to the hedge. "I can carry that in if you want," I said. Not a greeting, not small talk, just an offer. She looked up at me, hair stuck to her face, a smudge of dust across one cheek. "I would actually love that. Thank you." That was the first time I heard her voice. We didn't become friends right away. We became the kind of neighbors who are useful to each other in ordinary ways. I fixed a leaking kitchen faucet for her one Sunday. She started leaving sandwiches on the low wall by the hedge on afternoons when I was working outside, never saying much about it, just leaving them there like it was nothing. She worked night shifts as a nurse. Some mornings I'd be out on the porch with coffee around 7 and see her pulling into her driveway, eyes tired, still lifting a hand to wave when she saw me. I didn't know much about her life before Columbus. She never brought it up, and I never asked. There's a kind of respect in not asking, and I think we both understood that about each other early on. I remember the smell of fresh paint on those mornings, the sound of birds settling on the roofline, the shape of her moving past her kitchen window in the evenings before her shift, a shadow crossing the glass, and then gone. Small things, nothing that felt significant at the time. There was a particular kind of quiet in my life back then. It wasn't loneliness exactly. It was more like a room I'd deliberately emptied out because I didn't trust myself to fill it with the wrong things again. People told me I needed to get back out there, start dating, fill my calendar. I nodded along and did none of it. I wanted the next thing, whatever it turned out to be, to actually mean something. Clintonville suited me for reasons I didn't examine too closely at first. Quiet without being sterile. The houses on my street had that particular sameness to them, same brick, same porch layout, same low hedges dividing one yard from the next, which meant nothing to me until much later, when it turned out to matter more than I could have guessed. My work settled into a rhythm I didn't hate. Mornings for prep, afternoons for the actual painting, which I came to think of as a kind of meditation. There's something honest about that kind of work. You can see exactly what you did at the end of the day. Nobody outsources a wall that's already been painted. Dana, for her part, kept mostly to herself those first weeks. I noticed the rhythm of her life before I noticed much else about her porch light on late, then off early, her car gone by early evening most days, back again as the sun came up. After the day with the cardboard box, small interactions started happening more often. The way they do between two people living 20 feet apart with only a hedge between them. Nothing that meant anything on its own. Just the ordinary traffic of two adults figuring out how to be decent neighbors to each other. If you'd asked me back then, I would have told you, honestly, that we were friendly neighbors and nothing more. I think that's true. I think it's also true that something was already being built in those small, unremarkable exchanges long before either of us had a name for it. I'm telling you all of this because the night Dana climbed over that hedge wasn't as out of nowhere as it probably looked from where I was standing. I just hadn't understood yet what she actually meant by what she said. The night before, once she'd finally gotten free of the hedge and I'd walked her inside instead of standing there asking a dozen questions she clearly wasn't in any state to answer, I'd made her a glass of water she barely touched, found a blanket in the hall closet, and let her fall asleep on the sofa without pressing her for an explanation. It felt like the decent thing to do. It didn't feel like anything more than that. Not that night. Dana woke up on my sofa the next morning, my spare blanket pulled up over her, her sandals lined up neatly by the leg of the coffee table like she'd taken a moment, even half asleep and mortified, to set them down properly instead of just kicking them off. She went rigid the second she realized where she was. I set a cup of coffee down on the table in front of her, without looking directly at her, pretending to read, giving her whatever room I could to wake up without an audience. "I'm so sorry," she said. "I know how that looked. It looked like you were stuck in my hedge," I said, which was accurate. She laughed. Not a polite laugh, not the kind people do to fill silence a real one, surprised out of her before she could stop it. I looked up just in time to see her raise a hand to cover her mouth, and then let it drop again, like she'd decided it wasn't worth hiding. Over the next couple of weeks, we settled into something a little different than what we'd had before. I fixed the lock on her back door, the one that had kept her out that night in the first place. It turned out to be a simple fix, a cheap deadbolt that had been sticking for months, the kind of thing a landlord should have handled but never did. I didn't charge her for it, and she didn't offer to pay, which felt like its own kind of understanding between us. This wasn't a transaction anymore, not in the way it had been when I first carried a box in for her. She stood in the doorway while I worked on it, arms crossed, not saying much, and at one point she said, almost to herself, "I really did think it was my house. The layout's identical from the side. I wasn't even that drunk." I told her I believed her, and I meant it, though I still didn't understand yet what the second part of what she'd said that night was actually about. I didn't push her on it. It felt like the kind of thing you let sit until someone's ready to pick it back up on their own terms. On Saturday afternoons, we started standing on either side of the hedge with coffee, not really planning it, just both of us ending up out there around the same time. It wasn't a date. It was two people who happened to like the quiet of a Saturday morning, stretched a little longer than it needed to be, talking about nothing important, neither of us in any hurry to go back inside. We talked about small things during those Saturdays, a house I was painting that week, a difficult patient she'd had on her last shift, whether the weather was going to hold through the weekend. None of it was significant on its own. But I started looking forward to those mornings in a way I didn't examine too closely, the way you don't examine a habit until someone else points it out to you. One of those afternoons, she told me she liked Columbus because nobody here knew her from before. Clean slate, she said. I needed that. I didn't ask what she meant by before. She didn't offer anything more, and I let it sit there instead of pushing. There are things people tell you when they're ready, and things they tell you because you asked before they were ready, and those two things are never the same conversation. Looking back now, there were signs I noticed and didn't examine closely enough at the time. Dana had a habit, whenever she stood out on her porch, of angling herself so she was facing into her own yard, her back to the street, almost like she didn't want to look out at the road even when there was nothing obviously wrong with looking at it. I noticed it. I didn't think much of it in the moment. It seemed like a small quirk, the kind of thing everybody has, a habit that doesn't need a reason attached to it. There was another afternoon when her phone lit up on the porch rail between us, and she turned it face down and slid it into her pocket fast enough that I understood, without her saying anything, that she didn't want to talk about who it was. She never named the person in that conversation. Not once, not even in passing. I noticed that too. I didn't ask about it, not because I didn't care, but because I understood, even then, that some things people aren't ready to say out loud, and pushing on that only closes the door faster. I remember thinking, in a passing way I didn't dwell on, that whoever had sent that message had made her whole posture change in a matter of seconds. Her shoulders dropped a little. She kept talking, but the conversation lost some of its ease for the next few minutes before it slowly came back. I filed it away without asking myself what it meant. I wish, now, that I'd paid closer attention, but I also understand why I didn't. There was nothing yet that gave me a reason to. About a week after the night with the hedge, I was straightening up my hallway and found her other sandal still sitting in the corner where it had ended up that first night, half forgotten behind the door. I carried it over to her place myself, set it on her front step, and left without knocking, without texting her first, just leaving it there the way you'd return something borrowed. That afternoon, she sent me a message. Found it. Thank you. I keep losing one of the pair. I don't know why that line stuck with me the way it did. It wasn't a significant sentence on its own, but something about the way she phrased it, losing one of the pair, like it happened often, like it was a pattern in her life rather than an accident, sat with me longer than it should have. I read it 3 or 4 times before I put my phone down, which is a strange thing to admit about a 2-line text message, but it's true. Dana started finding small reasons to come over after that. She'd ask to borrow a screwdriver she clearly already owned one of. She'd ask if I knew a good mechanic, then mention the same question again 2 weeks later, like she'd forgotten she'd already asked. She asked what kind of bulb went in a hallway fixture, a question that took about 4 seconds to answer and somehow turned into 20 minutes of conversation about nothing in particular. I didn't analyze any of it while it was happening. I just helped, the way you help a neighbor, without reading too far into any single visit. She'd sit at my kitchen counter while I dug through a drawer for whatever she'd supposedly come to borrow, and we'd end up talking about something else entirely, a show she was watching, a coworker who kept scheduling her for shifts she hadn't agreed to, the particular exhaustion of being on your feet in a hospital hallway for 12 hours straight. None of it felt like courtship. It just felt like two people who liked talking to each other more than either of us had admitted out loud. But looking back now, from where I'm standing, I can see it clearly enough. Every time she came over, she didn't rush to leave. She'd linger 15 minutes, 20 minutes, saying things that didn't need to be said, finding one more small topic to bring up before she finally turned to go. I wasn't the one dragging those conversations out. She was. There was one evening in particular I keep coming back to. She'd come over supposedly to ask if I had a tape measure, which she absolutely did not need, since I'd seen one in her own kitchen drawer the week before. We ended up sitting on my back steps for close to an hour, watching the last of the light go out of the sky, talking about nothing that mattered, her opinion on the worst kind of hospital coffee, my theory about which paint colors people regret 2 years after choosing them. At some point, she laughed at something I said, tipped her head back, and for a second the porch light caught her face in a way that made me stop mid-sentence. I don't think she noticed. I made sure she didn't. I want to be fair to both of us here. I wasn't reading her wrong on purpose, and I wasn't blind either. I think I understood, somewhere underneath the surface, that something was shifting between us. I just didn't trust myself yet to name it, not after everything that had happened with my marriage, not when I still wasn't sure I had anything worth offering someone else. So I let it stay exactly where it was comfortable, unspoken, easy to walk back from if it turned out I was wrong about what I thought I was seeing. Dana, for her part, never pushed. She never said anything that could have been mistaken for more than friendly, but there was a consistency to the way she showed up, week after week, that I couldn't fully explain away as coincidence. People don't run out of screwdrivers that often. They don't forget the same mechanic recommendation twice in 1 month unless some part of them wants a reason to knock on a particular door. I'm not going to sit here and tell you I knew, back then, exactly what was happening between us. I didn't use words like that in my own head at the time. I wasn't thinking in terms of liking her, or falling for her, or any of the language that makes sense in hindsight. All I can tell you honestly is that there were afternoons that summer when I found myself listening for the sound of footsteps crossing through the gap in the hedge before I even registered that I was listening for anything at all. I'd catch myself glancing toward her side of the yard while I was mixing paint, or timing my coffee for a few minutes later than usual on the mornings I knew she'd be pulling in from a night shift. None of it felt deliberate while it was happening. It only looks deliberate now, laid out end to end, the way a pattern only becomes visible once you've got enough of it in front of you to see the shape. That was the first sign. I just didn't recognize it as one, not yet. By that point, things between Dana and me had settled into an easy rhythm that neither of us had ever formally acknowledged out loud. We didn't call it anything. We just kept showing up for each other in small ways, and I'd stopped questioning why that felt as natural as it did. I was painting Dana's front door a few weeks later, her idea, her paint, my labor, since I'd told her I wasn't going to let her pay me for something that would take an afternoon, when a black BMW pulled up along the curb in front of her house. The man who got out had on a white button-down, hair combed back with too much product, the kind of walk that belonged to someone who'd spent a long time thinking about how he looked while doing it. He glanced up at me on the ladder like I was part of the landscaping, something to be noted and then dismissed. "Is Dana home?" he asked. "Don't know," I said. It wasn't a lie. I genuinely didn't know if she was inside or not. I just wasn't going to volunteer anything either way to a stranger standing on her curb. Dana came to the door a second later, and I watched something in her whole body go rigid, just for an instant, before she caught herself. "Marcus," she said, "I told you not to come here." He didn't step onto the yard. He stayed on the sidewalk, talking in a voice that was calm in a way that felt deliberate, rehearsed, like he'd practiced sounding reasonable on the drive over. I just wanted to talk. I kept painting. I didn't look down at either of them, but I heard every word of it, and I noticed how careful he was to keep his tone even, almost gentle, in a way that somehow made me more uneasy than if he'd raised his voice. "Who's this?" Marcus asked, tilting his chin toward the ladder. "My neighbor," Dana said. "Right," Marcus said. Just that. One word, and somehow it carried more weight than a full sentence would have. He didn't need to say anything else. Then he turned, got back in the car, and drove off. Dana stood in the doorway for a moment after the BMW disappeared down the street, not saying anything, her arms crossed tight over her chest like she was holding something in place. I climbed down off the ladder. "You okay?" I asked. "He's my ex," she said. "He doesn't take no for an answer well. How long has he been showing up?" She was quiet for a few seconds, long enough that I almost changed the subject for her. "A few weeks." I nodded. I didn't ask anything else. I didn't offer advice she hadn't asked for, and I didn't press her for more details than she was ready to give. It wasn't my business to force open, and I understood by then that pushing wasn't going to make her trust me any faster. If anything, I'd learned that with Dana, the fastest way to close a door was to reach for it before she'd decided to open it herself. About 2 weeks after that, I started hearing things from other people on the street. Linda, an older woman who lived at the end of the block and spent most of her mornings on her porch with a cup of tea, stopped me while I was loading paint cans into my truck and asked if I knew what was going on with Dana. "What story?" I asked. She told me, in the careful, apologetic tone people use when they're about to repeat something they know they shouldn't, that someone had been saying Dana had a drinking problem, that she'd climbed into a stranger's house in the middle of the night. "I'm not one to gossip," Linda said, "but people are talking." I knew exactly where that story had come from, and I knew, standing there in my driveway, that it was close enough to true that it would be almost impossible for Dana to push back against it without sounding like she was covering something up. That's the thing about a rumor built on real events, you can't call it a lie, because it isn't one. You can only try to explain the context nobody's interested in hearing once the simpler, uglier version has already made the rounds. I thanked Linda for telling me, though I wasn't sure gratitude was really what I felt. I drove to the hardware store that afternoon with the radio off, running the conversation back through my head, trying to figure out how a private moment between two neighbors had turned into something being repeated on porches up and down the street. Dana called me that night, which was unusual. She almost never called. She texted, "Someone told my charge nurse about the night I was at your house," she said. "Ryan, I don't know how." "I know how," I said. There was a silence on the line, long enough that I could hear her breathing, steady but tight, the sound of someone working hard to keep her voice level. "He wasn't wrong about the facts," Dana said, her voice low and controlled in a way that told me she'd been holding this together for a while before she finally called me. "That's the worst part. He just arranged them." I understood exactly what she meant. Every piece of the story Marcus had apparently been telling people was technically true. She had shown up drunk at a neighbor's house late at night. She had climbed through a hedge to get there. None of that was fabricated. What Marcus had done was take those true pieces and arrange them in a way designed to make her sound unstable, reckless, someone whose judgment couldn't be trusted, instead of someone who'd had a rough night and made a small, forgivable mistake. "I don't even know how he found out," she said. "I didn't tell anyone at work. I barely told you." "Does it matter how?" I asked. "Or does it matter what we do about it now?" She let out a breath that wasn't quite a laugh. "I don't know what we do about it. You can't unring a bell like that. Everyone who's heard it already decided what they think of me before I got a chance to explain anything." "Not everyone," I said. "Linda told me because she trusts you enough to want to hear the real version. That's not nothing." Dana was quiet again. "I appreciate you saying that. I don't fully believe it right now, but I appreciate it." I told her I'd come by in the morning before her shift, that we didn't have to solve anything on the phone at 10 at night. She agreed, and we hung up, but I sat on my porch for a long time afterward, turning the whole thing over, trying to figure out what kind of person builds a weapon out of someone else's worst night and calls it looking out for them. I didn't go looking for Marcus. Marcus came to me. He pulled up outside my place a few days later, parked the same way he had outside Dana's deliberately, like he wanted to be seen doing it, and walked into my yard without waiting to be invited. I was on my knees in the flower bed along the front walk, and I stood up slowly, brushing dirt off my hands, giving myself a second before I said anything. "I hear you've been spending a lot of time next door," he said, hands in his pockets, standing like a man conducting an informal interview rather than trespassing on someone else's property. "I live next door," I said. He smiled slightly, the kind of smile that wasn't really about humor. "She does this," Marcus said, his tone almost consultative, like he was doing me a favor by warning me. "She latches onto someone safe. Then it becomes your problem." I looked at him. I wasn't angry, and I wasn't defensive. I just waited for him to finish saying whatever he'd driven over here to say, because I'd already decided nothing he told me was going to change how I felt about Dana, and I wanted to hear the whole thing so I understood exactly what kind of person I was dealing with. "You don't know her the way I do," he went on. "I'm not trying to cause problems. I just don't want to watch someone else go through what I went through." "What did you go through?" I asked, mostly to see what he'd say. He hesitated, just slightly, like the question had caught him without a scripted answer ready. "It doesn't matter. The point is, I know how this goes. I think you should go," I said. "I'm trying to help you." "I know you think that," I said. "Go anyway." He held my eyes for a second longer than he needed to, like he was deciding whether to push further, then apparently decided against it. He left. He didn't argue, didn't raise his voice, just got back in his car and drove off the same way he'd arrived, unhurried, like none of this had cost him anything at all. But the rumor didn't leave with him. Dana asked to switch shifts at the hospital that week so she wouldn't have to walk past certain coworkers, the ones she suspected had heard the story secondhand and were looking at her differently now. I noticed her porch light going off earlier than usual in the days after that, and I understood, without her having to explain it, that she was pulling inward, trying to make herself smaller until the talk died down on its own. I stopped by one evening with a container of the soup I'd made too much of, an excuse, and found her sitting at her kitchen table with her laptop open to her work schedule, staring at it without actually looking at it. She thanked me for the soup and didn't eat much of it. We didn't talk about Marcus directly that night. I think we both understood there wasn't anything new to say about him that hadn't already been said, and sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone is just sit at their table for an hour without asking them to perform being okay. What struck me most, in the weeks that followed, was how differently Dana carried herself compared to before any of this started. She'd always had a kind of quiet confidence about her, not loud, but steady, the confidence of someone who trusted her own judgment. Now I caught her second-guessing small things, asking me whether a decision sounded reasonable before she made it, checking in ways she hadn't needed to before. It made me angrier at Marcus than I let myself show her, because I could see exactly what he'd managed to chip away at, even from a distance, without laying a hand on her. I found myself paying closer attention to details I'd have brushed past before: how long she took to answer her door when I knocked, whether her car was in the driveway at times it usually wasn't, small changes in her routine that suggested she was rearranging her whole life around the possibility of running into him. None of it was dramatic. It was quieter than that, and in some ways more unsettling, because it meant the damage wasn't something you could point to directly. It was just a slow narrowing of the space she felt safe occupying. That sandal was still sitting on the shoe shelf in my hallway. I passed it every time I walked in or out of the house. I never quite understood, in the middle of everything else going on, why I hadn't just put it in a bag and left it on her porch weeks earlier. I told myself I kept forgetting. I'm not sure that was entirely true. Some nights I'd catch myself looking at it on my way out the door, this small, ordinary object that had somehow become tangled up with everything else happening between us, and I'd think about how strange it was that the worst part of this whole situation hadn't come from the man who'd once shared her life. It had come from the way he'd taken a single true story and handed it to strangers as a weapon, and there wasn't a clean way to fight that kind of thing, no matter how badly I wanted to. The days after Marcus showed up in my yard had a different weight to them than anything before. Dana and I still talked, still crossed paths through the hedge, but there was something unresolved hanging over both of us, a conversation neither of us had found the right moment to start. I could feel it building, the way you can feel weather changing before a single cloud shows up in the sky. Dana knocked on my door on a Tuesday night, around 9, no text beforehand to warn me she was coming. She was still in her scrubs, clearly just off a shift, which told me right away this wasn't a stop by to borrow something small. "Can I come in?" she asked. "Yeah," I said, stepping back to let her through. She sat down at my kitchen table, and for the first time since I'd known her, she didn't reach for the coffee I offered, didn't glance around the room the way she usually did when she came over. She just sat there, hands folded in front of her, like she'd rehearsed what she was about to say and was afraid that if she paused too long, she'd lose her nerve. I sat down across from her and waited. I'd learned by then that with Dana, patience mattered more than questions, that she'd get to whatever she needed to say on her own timeline if I just didn't crowd her. She told me about Marcus, the real version, not the fragments I'd pieced together from what she'd said before and what he'd implied while standing in my yard. She and Marcus had lived together for 3 years back in Cincinnati. It hadn't started out badly. He'd been attentive at first, the kind of attentive that felt flattering before it started to feel like something else. Slowly, over time, he'd taken over more and more of the decisions in her life, where she worked, who she saw, how she spent her evenings, until she realized she couldn't remember the last time she'd made a choice that was entirely her own. "It was never one big thing," she said. "It was never a moment I could point to and say, that's when it went wrong. It was 100 small ones. He'd have an opinion about a friend of mine, and slowly that friend wasn't around anymore. He'd say something was safer his way, and I'd just go along with it because arguing felt exhausting and pointless. By the time I noticed what had happened, I didn't recognize the version of myself I'd become. I listened without interrupting, watching her hands as she talked. The way they stayed folded but tightened slightly at certain parts of the story, like her body remembered things her voice was trying to keep steady. "The worst part was it happened slowly," she said. "So slowly I didn't notice until I couldn't breathe." She'd left in September, moved to Columbus specifically because nobody here knew her, because she wanted a version of her life that belonged only to her. "Clean slate," she said again, the same phrase she'd used months earlier on one of our Saturday mornings by the hedge, except this time I understood what it had actually cost her to say it. "I didn't leave dramatically," she said. "There wasn't a screaming fight or a slammed door. I just packed up while he was at a work event, took what fit in my car, and drove until Cincinnati wasn't in my rearview mirror anymore. I didn't leave a note. I think some part of me was afraid that if I gave him the chance to talk to me one more time, I'd stay." "That doesn't sound weak to me," I said. "That sounds like the hardest kind of decision there is." She gave a small, tired smile at that, the first real one since she'd sat down. It didn't feel like strength at the time. It felt like running. "He found me anyway," she said. "He always finds a way." "How?" I asked, gently, not pushing so much as trying to understand. "Social media, mostly. I wasn't hiding, not really. I just wasn't advertising where I'd landed either. Someone tagged me in something months ago, and I guess that was enough for him to start putting the pieces together. He didn't show up right away. He waited, sent a few messages first, testing to see if I'd respond. When I didn't, he decided showing up in person was the next logical step. Then she came to the part I'd been waiting for, without fully admitting to myself that I was waiting. "That night, I climbed through your hedge," she started, then stopped. "You don't have to explain that," I said. "I want to." She looked at me directly, the first time all evening she'd held my eyes for more than a second. I'd had too much to drink at a coworker's going-away party. I was stressed about Marcus texting me again, and I wasn't thinking clearly, and I forgot my keys inside my own house. Our houses look almost identical from the side, same siding, same porch light, same hedge line, and I wasn't drunk enough to be careless, but I was drunk enough to be confused. I genuinely thought I was climbing into my own yard. She paused, wrapping her hands more tightly around each other. I know it sounds like an excuse when I explain it that way. It isn't. I've thought about that night 100 times since, trying to figure out how something so ordinary turned into people whispering about me at work, and the honest answer is, it was just a bad night that happened to end up somewhere it shouldn't have. Nobody who's had a bad night gets to choose exactly how it looks from the outside, I said. That's not on you. She nodded slowly, like she was letting herself believe that a little more than she had before. But the second thing I said, Dana went on, her voice steadier now, like she'd crossed some threshold she'd been circling for weeks. I didn't know where else to go that wasn't about the house. I didn't say anything. I let the silence sit there because I sensed she needed the room to finish. I meant it, she said. I've been meaning it for a while. Longer than I probably should admit out loud. There's something about the way you don't ask for more than I'm ready to give that makes your house feel different than anywhere else I could have ended up that night. I think some part of me knew that, even drunk, even confused about which yard I was standing in. I didn't respond right away. I got up from the table and walked to the window, looking out at the dark yard, the hedge barely visible in the porch light. I thought about my marriage, about the 4 years that had quietly come apart, about the job I'd lost that I still sometimes dreamed about this rental house I'd never quite let myself call home. And I thought about all those Saturday mornings standing on either side of that hedge with coffee, neither of us saying anything that mattered, and both of us staying out there far longer than the conversation required. I noticed, I said, still facing the window. I just didn't think I was reading it right. Were you? I turned around and looked at her. Yeah, I was. She didn't say anything to that, but something in her shoulders eased, like she'd been holding a weight there for longer than I'd realized. For a moment, neither of us moved, the kitchen quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the faint sound of crickets through the screen door. I'm going to send him a final message tonight and block the number, she said. I should have done it weeks ago. Okay, I said. I just wanted you to know. In case it gets worse before it stops, then we deal with it when it gets worse, I said. You don't have to do that part alone. Dana looked at me for a long moment, didn't say anything, then nodded, slow and certain, the kind of nod that meant more than a sentence would have. Most people, when they find out about him, get this look, she said quietly. Like they're recalculating something about me, like the story changes who I am to them. You haven't done that. Not once, not tonight, not any of the times before tonight when you could have. You're not the story he told, I said. You're the person who got out of it. Those aren't the same thing, even if they sound like they should be. She was quiet for a moment, studying me like she was deciding whether to say something else. I keep waiting for you to ask why I let it go on as long as I did. Why I didn't leave sooner. I wasn't going to ask that, I said. It's not the kind of question that has a useful answer. People stay for reasons that make sense from the inside and look confusing from the outside. That's true of almost every hard decision anyone's ever made. I'm not interested in auditing yours. Something shifted in her face at that, something that looked like relief mixed with a kind of disbelief, like she hadn't quite expected anyone to say that to her without qualification. When she stood up to leave, she noticed the sandal sitting on the shoe shelf by my front door, the same one she'd been carrying the night she climbed through my hedge. You kept it, she said, not with any judgment in her voice, just an observation. I kept forgetting to give it back, I said. She looked at me for a second. Sure you did. I laughed, actually laughed. The first time I'd let myself do that in front of her, without trying to hold it back or dress it up as something smaller than it was. It felt strange, letting a moment be that light after everything we'd just talked about. But she was laughing too, and for a second, the whole weight of the evening lifted just enough for both of us to breathe. For the record, she said, still smiling. "I don't need it back. It's a terrible pair of shoes. I only wore them because they matched the dress, so I'm keeping a terrible sandal for no reason. You're keeping it because you wanted an excuse to bring it back over, and you never did," she said. I noticed that too. I didn't have a good answer for that, so I didn't try to give one. She left a few minutes later, and I stood at my door watching her cross back through the gap in the hedge to her own house. I didn't know exactly what was going to happen next between us, but for the first time in a long time, I found that I didn't feel the usual urge to know right away. The sandal stayed where it was, on the shelf, and something about that felt right. I closed the door and stood in my hallway for a while, looking at that shelf, at the small object that had somehow marked the beginning of all of this without either of us realizing it at the time. I thought about how strange it was that a mistake, a wrong hedge, a wrong yard, a moment of drunken panic had turned out to be the truest thing either of us had said to each other in months. I didn't have a name for what came next. I just knew I wasn't in any hurry to walk away from it. In the week after that conversation, small things started to shift between us without either of us announcing it out loud. I started leaving my back hallway door unlocked in the evenings. Not wide open, just unlocked, in a way that didn't need explaining. Dana started leaving her shoes on my porch instead of her own, a pair here, a pair there, like some part of her had already decided this was where she belonged in the evenings. Neither of us said anything about it. We just let it happen. I noticed the change in small ways before I noticed it in big ones. She started keeping a spare toothbrush in my bathroom without asking whether that was presumptuous. I started buying the kind of coffee she liked instead of just what I liked, without really deciding to do that, just picking it up at the store one day because it seemed obvious. Neither of us treated any of this as a milestone. It just accumulated, one small choice at a time, until the shape of our lives had quietly rearranged itself around each other. Some evenings I'd catch myself setting out 2 mugs instead of 1 before I'd even registered that she was coming over. My hands moving ahead of my thinking, like some part of me had already accepted what the rest of me was still catching up to. We had dinner together for the first time that week, an actual sit-down dinner instead of coffee across the hedge. I cooked, she brought a bottle of wine, and neither of us called it anything in particular. It was just dinner. It felt like more than that anyway. She helped me clean up afterward, standing next to me at the sink in a way that felt entirely unremarkable and entirely significant at the same time, the two things sitting comfortably next to each other for what felt like the first time in either of our lives. Marcus made one more appearance in all of this, though it turned out to be the last. He called from a number Dana didn't recognize, since his usual number had already been blocked, and I happened to be the one who picked up her phone off the counter when it rang while she was in the shower. "She's not available," I said. "Don't call again." He didn't say anything back. He just hung up. I stood there for a second afterward, phone still in my hand, waiting to see if he'd call again immediately, the way people sometimes do when they're not ready to accept an answer. He didn't. That single silence on the other end of the line ended up saying more than any conversation could have. 3 days later, an envelope showed up in Dana's mailbox. No return address. Her name written in handwriting I recognized from a card Marcus had apparently sent her once before, back when things were good between them. Dana and I sat on her back steps together while she opened it. It was a single handwritten page, talking about the early days of their relationship, the version of things he apparently still believed in. She read about half of it, her face unreadable, then folded it back up and dropped it straight into the trash bag by her feet without finishing it. "I don't need to finish it," she said. I nodded. I didn't ask what it said. Some part of me was curious. I won't pretend otherwise, but it wasn't my place to want to know more than she wanted to tell me. She sat there for a minute afterward, looking out at the yard, and I didn't fill the silence with anything. Eventually, she said, quietly, "I used to think if I explained myself well enough, he'd understand. It took me a long time to realize some people don't want to understand. They want to win." I didn't have a response that felt adequate to that, So I just reached over and put my hand over hers on the step, and she let it stay there. That was the last time Marcus appeared in this story in any form. No more calls, no more letters, no more black BMW parked outside either of our houses. He simply stopped, the way people do once they finally understand a door has actually closed. I won't pretend I know what changed for him, whether he found someone else to focus his attention on, or whether some part of him finally accepted that this particular chapter of his life was over. I only know that our street got quieter after that, in a way both of us noticed, but neither of us needed to comment on out loud. 2 months after that, Dana and I had settled into something neither of us had formally named, but both of us understood completely. She didn't announce that she was staying later. She just started staying later, day after day, until eventually she was just there most evenings, and neither of us thought to comment on it anymore. There was no conversation where we defined what we were to each other. It just became obvious over time, the way a season changes without anyone announcing the exact day it happened. One night, she fell asleep on my sofa for the second time. This time it wasn't because she'd climbed through the wrong hedge, wasn't because she was drunk or confused about which house was hers. She was just tired and comfortable, and it didn't occur to either of us that she should get up and go home. I pulled the same blanket over her that I had that first night, and this time I understood exactly what it meant to be the person doing that. I stood there for a minute longer than I needed to, watching her breathe steady and even, thinking about how different this felt from the first time, even though the shape of the moment was almost identical. I remember thinking, standing there in my own living room at nearly midnight, that I hadn't planned any of this. I hadn't gone looking for someone to fill the empty room I'd built for myself after my marriage ended. She'd shown up uninvited, quite literally, climbing over a hedge in the dark, and somehow that had turned out to be exactly the kind of arrival that worked for both of us. Nothing about it had been smooth or deliberate. It had just been honest, one small moment after another, until it added up to something neither of us could easily walk away from anymore. 8 months after the night with the hedge, Dana changed her phone number, not out of fear this time, just because she didn't need the old one anymore, didn't need the version of her life that number belonged to. She stopped asking to switch shifts at the hospital. She went to work, did her job, came home, the way anyone does when their life has stopped requiring quiet negotiations with fear. I watched her walk out the door some mornings with an ease I hadn't seen in her before, shoulders relaxed, no glance thrown toward the street out of old habit. It was a small thing, easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. I was paying attention. Around that same time, she started talking about the future in small, ordinary ways, mentioning a vacation she wanted to take someday, a house she'd seen for sale a few streets over that she thought had good bones, plans that assumed I'd still be around when they happened. I noticed the shift in her language before I said anything about it. She'd stopped hedging her sentences the way people do when they're not sure how permanent something is. She just talked like the future was something we were both going to be part of, and I found I liked that more than I knew how to say out loud. The boxwood hedge between our 2 yards never came down. We never talked about cutting it back or taking it out entirely, but we stopped walking around to the gate that connected our 2 driveways. We just started stepping through the small gap her feet had worn into the branches that very first night, the one neither of us had ever bothered to trim back into shape. It became a kind of unofficial doorway between our 2 lives, worn smoother with every crossing, a shortcut neither of us needed to explain to the other anymore. 14 months after that night, which brings us to right now, Dana moved in with me 3 months ago. It wasn't a big event. There wasn't a conversation where we decided this formally. She just started bringing more clothes over, and one day she stopped taking them back to her own house, and that was that. The house next door has new tenants now, a young couple who leave their bicycles out on the porch, and every time I see them coming and going, I think about how strange it is that a house can hold so many different chapters of different people's lives without any of them knowing about the others. I'm sitting here writing all of this down while Dana calls from the kitchen. "Coffee's ready," she says. I can hear the sound of a mug being set down, a chair being pulled out from the table, all the ordinary sounds of an ordinary morning that somehow feel like the most remarkable thing in the world to me now. There was a time, not that long ago, when mornings like this felt like something that happened to other people, in other houses, to people who hadn't lost a job or a marriage or the sense that they knew what came next. I don't think that way anymore. That cream sandal is still on the shelf in my hallway. Dana never picks it up to wear it anymore. I asked her once why she keeps it there instead of using it or throwing it out. "It doesn't match anything I own anymore," she said. "But I like that it's there." I understood what she meant. It was never really about the shoe. It was about the night it belonged to, and the version of both of us that existed before we knew what that night was actually going to become. There are things that don't start with a beautiful moment. They start with someone stuck halfway through a hedge close to midnight, one shoe in her hand, looking at you with absolutely no idea what she's going to say next. Sometimes that turns out to be the best thing that could have happened to either of you. I think about that a lot now, sitting in a kitchen that used to feel too quiet, listening to a voice that used to belong to the house next door. Some beginnings only make sense once you've lived far enough past them to see the whole shape, and this was one of those. I wouldn't trade a single confused, panicked, badly timed second of it. I didn't know what I wanted the night Dana climbed over that hedge. I just know that when she said the second thing, something in me settled instead of tightened. I didn't understand it right away. I didn't understand it for weeks, honestly. But maybe that matters less than the fact that I didn't close the door on her, that I let a confused, panicked stranger with one shoe in her hand come inside without demanding she explain herself first. Looking back on it now, I think that's the part I'm proudest of, if pride is even the right word for it. Not that I was clever enough to understand what was happening in the moment. I wasn't. It took me weeks to catch up to what she'd already told me standing in my doorway. I just didn't get in the way of it while it was unfolding, and I've come to believe that sometimes the whole job not solving anything, just not standing in the way of the good thing trying to happen. Dana didn't come to me because she was weak. She came because she knew, even in some hazy, half-formed way, that my house was somewhere she wouldn't have to explain herself before she was ready to. She'd spent years in a relationship where every choice she made needed someone else's approval first. Then she moved to a new city, built a new life with her own two hands, and started over from nothing in a place where nobody knew her name. The night she climbed the wrong hedge wasn't a weakness. It was the first time in a long time she trusted that someone wouldn't judge her for not being perfect. I think about that distinction a lot now. It's easy, from the outside, to look at someone who's had a rough night and decide it tells you something permanent about who they are. It doesn't. It usually just tells you they're human, same as the rest of us, doing their best on a night that didn't go the way they planned. I've had nights like that too, though mine never ended with me climbing through anyone's hedge. We all have our own version of the wrong yard at midnight. Marcus isn't a villain out of a movie. He's someone who believed control was the same thing as care, that knowing someone well enough gave him the right to decide things for her. The most dangerous thing he ever did wasn't showing up at Dana's door, and it wasn't standing in my yard trying to warn me off. It was taking small, true details and building a false story out of them, one designed to make her sound unstable instead of simply human. Truth in the hands of someone with bad intentions stops being truth. It just becomes a weapon, and it's one of the hardest kinds to defend against, because you can't call it a lie. A cream sandal sits on a shelf in my hallway. There's nothing special about it on its own. It's a cheap pair of shoes that don't match anything either of us owns anymore. But it reminds me, every day, that some nights people end up in the wrong place and somehow still land exactly where they needed to be. I've thought about buying her a new pair a dozen times, something nicer, something that actually fits her life now. I never have. I don't think either of us wants that shelf to look any different than it does. I think there are things we wait too long for because we keep holding out for the right moment, the right circumstances, the right way to say it. But sometimes, The right moment is 11:46 at night. Someone caught halfway through your hedge, saying something you don't fully understand until much later, long after you've already let them in. The door I almost didn't open turned out to be the one that mattered most. Have you ever misunderstood something someone said to you, only to look back later and realize you'd understood it exactly right the whole time? And if someone ever used the truth about you as a weapon, what did you do to take your story back? I'd genuinely like to know. I think more people carry some version of this than any of us admit out loud. If this one hit something in you, even a little, leave a comment down below. I read every single one, even the short ones, even the ones that are just a sentence. Hit like if you made it this far with me, and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. We put out new stories every week, and I appreciate every one of you who shows up for them.